This is the Promising Practices for Health Equity podcast, brought to you by the Interdisciplinary Research Leaders Program, a national leadership program of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation.
Hello, and welcome to Promising Practices for Health Equity, the podcast created by the Interdisciplinary Research Leaders Program, affectionately known as IRL. I'm your host, Crystal Lee, and my co-host today is J. Robin Moon, Associate Director of Research for IRL. Hey, Robin.
Hey, Crystal.
In our last episode, we talked about the Interdisciplinary Research Program, IRL. We talked about how this podcast came about and our goal of amplifying what we are calling promising practices. Promising practices are activities, procedures, or approaches that have shown positive results for us in the context of IRL, and that we think are worth understanding what makes them promising so that you, or listeners, can replicate, adapt, or adopt them in your efforts to achieve health and other kinds of equity. One of these promising practices is storytelling. And today we are fortunate to have the storytelling guru himself, Luis Ortega, as our guest. Luis is a multidisciplinary storyteller, educator, facilitator, narrative strategist, and the founder and director at Storytellers for Change. Hi, Luis. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Crystal. Hi, Robin. Thank you for inviting me.
Luis, we're so happy to have you with us. Before we ask you to tell us about yourself and your work briefly, we invite you to engage with us in one of our IRL promising practices, that is to check in with each other. One of our core beliefs is that nurturing personal relationships is a key to building the kinds of communities that collaborate effectively in the work towards health equity. So at the beginning of most of our meetings at IRL, we do a quick check-in to help us continuously build connections in the personal way within our team and our beloved community. So here's our check-in for today, which is actually something that we've done with you. How are you physically, intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually? Also known as PIES. It's a nice acronym, PIES. I will start. Physically, I am actually in New Mexico this week, driving hours to reach national parks, the land that used to be coexisting with the Native Americans. So I'm a little tired physically. Intellectually, I am very stimulated, especially with this podcast recording. Emotionally, I'm exhausted with a nonstop hammering of all the stuff that's going on in our country. But spiritually, I am full of hope. And that's something that I would really like to attribute to our storytelling training and practice that, Luis, you have helped us. I'm going to toss it to Crystal.
Thanks, Robin. Physically, I am feeling fine. I'm feeling rested, which is unusual for me. So I'm very grateful for that. Intellectually, I am also feeling stimulated. Part of it is because of my work with IRL, but also spring is approaching and I'm planning my garden.
Yes.
So I'm planting some things that I've never planted before, to include asparagus. I got some asparagus roots yesterday. So I've never seen that. They look like aliens. Or like an octopus or something. So I'm doing my research on how best to promote growth of the asparagus. Emotionally, I'm a little bit tired. My parents are having some health issues, and dealing with aging parents can be exhausting, and that's where I am with that. And spiritually, I just feel calm, which is unusual for me. Usually I'm an anxious person, but I've had to lean into some of the promising practices that I've learned in IRL, paying attention to myself and taking care of myself, doing some reflection, focusing on the moment instead of trying to fix what's going to happen tomorrow. So that's where I stand, and I'm going to toss it to you, Luis.
Thank you, Crystal, and thank you, Robin, for checking in. And I physically feeling strong, but also my body is telling me that I should be outside running right now, because usually around this time is when I go for a run. So my body knows, somatically, it just knows So after this podcast, I'm going to go for a run, and I'm looking forward to that. Intellectually, as well as emotionally, I'm meditating a lot on. I just reread Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents by Octavia Butler, and I'm spending a lot of time just thinking around how change is the great constant, and that proverbial quote from those books that everything that you touch changes you, and everything that it's in relationship with you is continuously in flow and in change. And I'm emotionally embracing that for more than a few reasons, including that tomorrow is my birthday. So I'm just thinking about change in that particular way, but also just about our greater social political landscape and what it means to engage with that. And spiritually, I would say that I feel very rooted, and I'm feeling very connected to my partner, to my family, to my friends, to the work that I do. And that's a practice that I've been cultivating for some time now. And I'm just grateful to be in that space right now.
Thank you so much, Luis, and happy birthday, early birthday. Let's get into it. Okay, I want us to tell the story to our audience how we met. So we met you, Luis. There's always two sides of the story. We will tell our side first. Last year, we met you last year as Crystal and I as co-chairs of the IRL's annual leadership meeting in October 2024, and we were in search of a storytelling and narrative change workshop leader. We made storytelling the main theme of the entire meeting as the path to reimagine our world with health equity. The details of which we're hoping that you will talk about today. And I'm grateful that you mentioned Octavia Butler, because we've been reading Emergent Strategies by Adrienne Marie Brown and Grace Lee Boggs quote that I'm thinking in that book: we need to transform ourselves before we transform our community. So we were looking for an expert who could provide a skills building workshop that is about storytelling as the means, not the end goal to build our beloved community. It turns out that the task was not very easy, and we spoke to many potential organizations, including the big names that we all know, no names mentioned, but it was just not the right fit. And we were like, what is it that we're looking for? We knew one thing, that we were looking for Marshall Gann's model of like story of self, story of us, story of now, and really it had to be a tool for community building. So when we finally met with you, we just knew at that point that you were the one. That's the story that we tell about how we met. And that's the match made in heaven, as we'd like to think. So tell us about your experience with getting connected with us with IRL. What resonated with you specifically about the work that we're trying to do here with IRL?
Yeah, certainly. I remember a few items that you just highlighted that immediately align with my ethos and how I think about the role of storytelling, not only in forming and shaping beloved community, but also in the context of healing, equity work, and just more broadly speaking, transformation work. I would say that there was also a great deal of alignment when I heard that you were engaging with Dr. Sean Wright's work, particularly his book, The Four Pivots. And even before that book, I was already greatly influenced by Dr. Jean Wright's work around healing center engagement, which has played a huge role in helping me to integrate an intentional healing framework within my narrative and storytelling work. I remember us having a lot of conversations, to your point, Robin, not only about what it means to engage in storytelling as an outcome, as a product, right? A story that you tell, but the importance of creating a holding space where the process through which we craft the stories is intentional, is relational, is inviting us to see ourselves and each other. The process itself, it's healing. It's not just telling stories about health equity, but how do we actually find equitable relationship building? How do we find healing within ourselves and each other as we craft those stories? So that conversation was very energizing for me because I found a lot of alignment in your language and the scholars and practices that were informing your work, which mirror a lot of some of the frameworks that inform my work. And I would say, lastly, just with you and Crystal, as we engage in that initial conversation, for me, it was also important to see that there was a resonance around not just talking about storytelling as a skill, which certainly it is. You can cultivate storytelling as a skill, but what does it mean for us to engage with storytelling as an embodied practice? In other words, how do we honor each other as storytellers? And that to me is essential to the systems transformation work that we need to do. And ultimately, I left that initial call feeling energized and hoping, crossing my fingers that this would work out for us to partner, and it did. And it's just been truly beautiful to be with you in this journey since then.
We are so grateful that we found you, we discovered you, and we take all the credit. And I personally have become your disciple in learning and training how to be a collaborative, a community-centered storyteller. Tell us, Luis, what connection do you see there is between health equity work? Because we're really talking about health equity in the end now, between health equity work, community engaged research, and storytelling.
Yeah, certainly. And I'm going to give you a more personal micro answer, and
Sure.
then I'll expand and I'll talk more from a macro and meta perspective systematically. I think the first thing that I want to offer is that I fundamentally believe that our well-being as individuals, as a society, as communities, is directly interconnected with the stories that surround us. And by extension, I would say the stories that live within us. So to give you a very micro example, I came into this world. I'm from 1987, March 28th, at around 1:30 a.m. And when I came to this world, right, almost 38 years ago, I came to this world, right, in Tenochtitlan, today known as Mexico City, with a mother who I dearly love and dearly loves me, with a grandmother, and a couple months later, about a year and 8 months later, my two younger sisters joined me, and that was my upbringing, right? My mother, my grandmother, and my two sisters. Growing up, the stories that I knew were stories that affirmed me. I felt loved. I felt cared for. I felt meaning. I felt connected. I spent a lot of time with my grandmother drawing and learning how to express myself through, as someone that was a bit more introverted, I found a great deal of expression through the arts.
Mm.
In my sisters, I found not only a sense of friendship, but also responsibility and wonder. And in my mom, I found, and to this day, I continue to find tremendous guidance and wisdom and a friend. And as I grew up, I began to encounter other stories. As I began to reckon with my sexuality as someone that's queer and bisexual, I began to encounter narratives that told me that I was wrong, to the point where I did not actually come out to my family, to my mom, to my sisters, those same people that make me feel so loved and affirmed. I did not come out to them until my mid-20s. I began to encounter narratives about my mestizaje, right? Or this idea of being mestizo, the explanation, the story that we give to why is it that I speak the way I speak? Why do I speak Spanish and not Nahuatl? Why is my skin this particular color, right? Why is my hair texture the way it is? I began to encounter narratives also about how I should relate to others or not. And eventually, when I was 14 years old and I moved to this country and I had to deal with other racial narratives, I had to deal with immigrant narratives, I had to navigate and continue to navigate this political landscape as an undocumented immigrant, I kept encountering stories. Now, why do I start with this? Because for me, there's a tremendous contrast in the type of stories that I encountered as a child that fundamentally allowed me to hold myself and hold others with a profound sense of love and connection. And what feels to me as a persistent and ongoing struggle that I've had to navigate as I deal with all these other stories that made me feel extremely disconnected from self and from others. And I think from a systemic perspective, and this is where I began to be informed by the work of Dr. Shonjin Wright and others, I begin to analyze and understand how these stories that are fundamentally rooted on a belief system that has created a hierarchy of human value, is a tremendous barrier to any effort to actualize equity and health. It's just not compatible. An ideology that sustains a belief that there is hierarchy of human value with the idea of achieving health equity. And therefore, the challenge is that if we live in a society where racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, right, where we continue to have tremendous hate directed towards immigrants and refugees, particularly those who are Black and brown, particularly directed towards people who are suffering because of displacement, we have a challenge. And so much of what we have today is systematically, structurally built in the US, certainly, and although this is the case in many other places across the world, is systems that are driven by these ideologies and that are embedded within the logic of how these systems operate. So they are working exactly how they should be working. And these narratives are fundamentally also connected to what I think MIT scholar Otto C. Charmer correctly diagnoses as the most important challenge that we have to tackle in the 21st century, and that is the challenge of disconnection. And from that perspective, I think there are three big narratives that we need to counter and tackle if we are to address issues of health equity. He characterizes them in the following way. He talks about the challenge of ecological separation, social separation, and spiritual separation or disconnection. The first one is this idea that we as human beings are separate from nature, right? This is the narrative that tells us that we are here to exploit nature and that's just the way it is. The second narrative, social separation, is this idea that there is a we and there is a them. And this is what scholar John A. Powell also refers to as the challenge of othering, right? We other people. This is returning to this idea of a hierarchy of human value. And last but not least, this idea of spiritual separation is the idea of how do I separate myself from myself? So those narratives that tell me I'm wrong, I don't belong in myself, I'm broken, right? So this is where we can talk about this crisis in loneliness, right? That oftentimes gets cited now in all kinds of different articles. We can talk about this complete sense of isolation, of suffering, and even diagnosing trauma or sickness through an individual lens instead of thinking about the collectivist nature and or systemic nature of why are these symptoms emerging. And if we have, I firmly believe this, if we have any hope, right, in addressing any of these isms, any of these issues of separation, I believe that we need narrative and storytelling to counter these narratives. And I'll offer one more item before I close this particular reflection. I think countering these narratives is essential because we do have to name them and understand them and unpack them. And on the other end, we also need to generate new possibilities. And this is where, going back to Dr. Shangin Rice's work, it's really important. His pivot around going from problem loving, right, or just naming problems, unpacking problems. So this is where my background as a researcher, as an educator, is a bias, right? Because I was taught to analyze problems first and foremost. Even in my early training around storytelling, I was taught to always help your audience understand the problem. That's fantastic. That is a type of storytelling tactic that we need, and it's also limiting because we need other paradigms and other forms of engaging with narrative that invite us to also create new ways of being. So this is where I'll close by just offering Liam Bell's, an educator scholar from Columbia University, who created something called the storytelling project model. And in it, she names 4 types of narratives that are part of what I refer to as our narrative ecosystem. She calls our attention to the stock narrative, which is the dominant story. I already spent time unpacking that right now, hierarchy of human value. Concealed stories. What are the stories that are concealed by these dominant ideologies? Both stories of trauma and neglect and marginalization, but also stories of joy, of resilience, resistance stories, the stories of people, movements, organizations that have always struggled against and push back on the dominant ideology, right? And this is where the countering piece comes into play, right? And content storytelling comes into play. But then there's this 4 quadrant. And I think this is where we need to be for us to engage in health equity work. Liam Bell refers to this as the emergent or transforming stories space. And this is where we need to focus our attention, I believe, not to ignore the concealed and resistant stories or to counter and name and unpack the stock, but we need to critically analyze ourselves and our efforts and our work as organizations and practitioners and researchers and ask ourselves, how much time are we actually spending in the paradigm shifting practice of proposing new possibilities and new ways of being? If we are going to achieve health equity, we need emergent and transforming stories that help us visualize, imagine, and believe in the possibility of health equity.
Luis, as always, every time you speak, I try to take copious notes.
Yeah, I saw you were doing that, Crystal.
That's exactly what I'm doing. So I just want to ask a follow-up question as it relates to some of the things that you have said before. I really want to highlight this for our listeners. Is one of the things you talked about are the ideologies that are embedded in the logic of how our systems operate and how the systems are operating as intended, right? Based on those ideologies upon which they are built. And you talked about the need to have narratives that counter these ideologies in order to change these systems. And then you also mentioned one of the ways to do that is to name, understand, and unpack these narratives. And then beyond that, to create new paradigms that create new ways of being. So I want to ask you to go a little deeper with us around those concepts that you have highlighted and talk to us about what do you see as the role of storytelling in dismantling the systems that are operating as intended, but to change those to promote and perpetuate health equity instead of what we are seeing right now.
Yeah, certainly. And I can again start with a personal example, and then I can offer some thoughts, insights around how these could manifest at a macro or meta level. I recall a few years ago now, I participated in storytelling program, and I was asked by one of the lead mentor facilitator for the session, asked the question, what does it mean to feel whole, to feel well, and to be in just relationship with yourself and others? That was the entire purpose of this particular program. And mind you, at this point, I've spent a lot of time reflecting on those questions without necessarily phrasing them in that particular way. But what I can tell you is that what emerged for me and what was reaffirmed, because I feel like I had already articulated this, yet I realized in a profoundly deeply way that I would have to continue to practice these, is that my external systems work requires internal systems work. In other words, that if I'm going to seek to change any of these narratives, right, any of these isms and phobias externally through my narrative change strategy, through my storytelling, I have to do the work of shifting those narratives internally as well. And I'm not going to get into the nuance right now of thinking through, is this a chicken and egg situation? Which one goes first? We need to do both things, right? We need to move in a flow between working externally and internally. And the external work will support our internal work. And most certainly the internal work will support the external work. The one thing that I will say, though, is that too often what I see organizations and systems do is completely externalize this work. So I would say about 90% of the time, and this is just me on the spot reflecting on this, about 90% of the time, when I'm engaging with large systems, that is the ask. Help us figure this out externally. They are eager, ready, and willing to tell the story externally, but there's tons of barriers and hesitation to do any of the internal work. And I asked then critically, what happens when the external narrative is in dissonance with internal narrative? Misalignment, right? There's no wholeness, there's no wellness, there's no just relationship. So this is where transactional storytelling happens. This is where telling that gets standing ovation, right? And maybe brings in the dollars, right? And the funding also perpetuates harm and also perpetuates inequity and also, right, perpetuates these practices that are extremely harmful to our long-term work of building relationships, building trust, building solidarity, building community. So there has to be an alignment there that I think we continue to struggle with. These questions that allow me to, and by the way, which I don't have answers to any of them, I have an ongoing process of me seeking wholeness, of me seeking wellness, of me seeking just relationship with myself. I think we need to think of those questions collectively as well. What does it mean for us to think of ourselves as part of a whole, right? What does it mean for us to be well, not just individually, but as a society? And that's not how our systems think. That's not how our healthcare system was designed to work. We are not diagnosing, although I would say there's definitely research. I don't want to say that there's a complete absence of dialogue around this. My critique is towards how our healthcare system works, right? And by default, many other systems, our education system works. We see individual students, we create individual students. We are not thinking about the quality of a learning community, although too often that is where precisely some of the issues that we need to tackle exist in the collective. And we need to think about what does it mean for us to have justice to ourselves, to each other. Stories that allow us to pursue not complete answers, because I think I don't believe in absolute answers. I believe in the process of us seeking what it means to do this. All seeking stories that move us in that direction is the type of narrative work that would allow us to reimagine what these new ways of being, right? New structures, new ways of relating to each other, new systems can help us achieve health equity.
Oh, that's so great. Thank you, Luis. Speaking of tension, outside tension when discussing systems change, there's another kind of tension, the tension between system change versus local change, like a local community change. So in recent years, we have heard about the need for structural change, and in particular, IRL has been pursuing structural racism, dismantling structural racism, and for investing in that, which wasn't really the case, say, like 20 years ago. So there is a progress towards health equity in that sense. But there is still this tension. The structural change is hard, it takes a long time, while our local communities need help here and now. So it's like a long term, short term, like the tension between in terms of temporality. We need, I'm gonna air quote that, evidence, rigorous science, ROI, a return on investment, scalability, etc., to ensure the structure change that we pursue is worth the investment. But then, do we? And that's a age-old question that social epidemiologists struggle with. So I wanted to ask you, how do we balance these two ends of the pole, long-term system change and short-term and more localized community change, and possibly the role of storytelling? I think you already got into talking about it in terms of outcomes versus process of this work.
Yeah, certainly. And I think I'll start by saying that I welcome the tension as long as the tension is guiding us towards healing and solidarity with each other as we navigate the challenges ahead. I think the tension will allow us to be good relatives to each other. I think a lot about the seven generation principle from indigenous teachings that tells us that as we make decisions, we need to be thinking about the impact of our decisions seven generations ahead. And on the other end, I spent a lot of time reflecting on what decisions were made seven generations ago that impact how I'm showing up in the world today. And
Mm.
I think about my Mexica and my Nahua ancestors and what they faced and what they went through the process of colonization, through the process of resisting and persisting through that process, and how that struggle is still alive today, but also that resilience and that wisdom and those teachings are still there today. And it gives me both a sense of humility and also responsibility to think about the longer arc of just history. And this is where this tension of the change that takes time and the change that's possible within the now. And again, if we embrace it and it allows us to be in closer relationship with each other and to have greater discernment in how do we take care of each other, our ancestors, as well as our future generations, then I'm all for struggling with that tension. However, what I do have to name, and I think is in the subtext of the question, I think, is that too often the source of these tensions that you're naming, Robin, from my perspective, they are the product of dominant ideology and narrative, like a sense of urgency, scalability, success, quote unquote, right? Best practices, quote unquote, knowledge. Who holds valid knowledge? How is this provable? What is the return on investment? And who gets to set the terms of that particular agenda? And that tension, I'm not here for it. I just It's not going to take us, is the dissonance that I was naming earlier, right? It does not facilitate trust. It does not facilitate relationship. It does not facilitate healing. It does not facilitate a way for us to cultivate introspection and see ourselves in a way that allows us to engage in the transformation work that is required. So I don't understand how processes that are inherently inequitable and completely decoupled from community can in any way lead us to equitable outcomes. It just makes no sense to me. So we need different stories and narratives that reshape that logic for us. And this is not to say that we cannot talk about accountability, right? Or we cannot talk about how do we engage in research. We absolutely can have those conversations. I'm even up for having a conversation of how do we redefine what rigorous research is, if and only if in that process we're centering community wisdom, equity, healing, justice as part of our definition of what it means to be rigorous and who is accountable to that type of rigor. So I think from that perspective, I'll come back to Dr. Sean Jun, right? Honestly, how do we answer that question of how do we balance this work? Dr. Shanjin Wright offers us some pretty good ideas, right? Those four pivots going from lens to mirror, seeing ourselves, right? Doing the internal work, being relational and not transactional in the work, pivoting from problem to possibility, moving into flow instead of just the hustle and the grind of just producing and producing and producing work without us actually engaging in the process of flowing through that work. So to me, holding space for those pivots and for us to understand how do we move there is how we deal with that tension in a way that allows us to build that solidarity and to facilitate healing.
Thank you so much, Luis. You could not have said it better. Our intention and aspiration for this podcast to be my spiritual with the gauge meter just went up by 4 times. Thank you. I know that we rattled off a lot of great citations and resources from the very beginning. For our listeners, we will definitely list those out in our show notes. But for our listeners, for this time being, Louise, who want to learn how to use storytelling as a tool in their health equity work and who might not have thought about this before in the extent that we might have so far, where do they start? Are there any books, blogs, websites, podcasts, YouTube videos, something simple, key resources that you might recommend?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say Storytelling for Social Justice by Liam Bell. To just offer a brief framing around that, this particular book will introduce you to the concept that we discussed earlier in the podcast about stock stories, concealed stories, resistant stories, emergent transforming stories. It's a slightly different storytelling book because I think oftentimes when we think about storytelling, we are wanting to think about characters and the plot of a story
Mm,
and the setting and the moral, which are we do need to understand what it means to engage with those different elements of narrative. And I think it's fundamentally important for us, especially in the context of this podcast, right? Like health equity, for us to understand what is the role of power and what is the role of systems in shaping our experience of story. And I think Liam Bell's work and this particular tool of thinking of this quadrant, right, of narratives to analyze our narrative ecosystem is crucial to that work. So I definitely recommend that book. It's a very short read, heavy on theory, but it also has some very practical elements to it. And even though it has a focus on education, it's very applicable to all kinds of different settings. I think to have more of a focus on personal narrative, collective narrative. You mentioned Marshall Gann's work earlier in the podcast as well, and I certainly think that there's probably no other framework out there that I can think of that offers a best introduction at what it means to engage with storytelling as a practice of leadership and community organizing than Marshall Gann's public narrative. There's way too many resources to name them all, but honestly, any Google search that just puts like Marshall Gann's public narrative, like you'll find so many YouTube videos of Marshall lecturing on the topic, like the same lectures that he delivers at the Kennedy School are available freely online. He just published a new book. There's tons of toolkits out there. There's worksheets. There's just so much out there that's accessible for those who just want to read an article and kind of get started. To those that want to take a deep dive, absolutely recommend Marshall Gann's work. And then I think lastly, I'll go back to just the four pivots. I think even though it's not a book that teaches you how to tell your story, I do think that Dr. Sean Jean Wright's writing engages with story in a really good way. So if you want to see an example of what it means to engage in that introspection, Dr. Sean Jean Wright role models for us through his own reflections, through his own mirror work in the book, right? Of how he's thinking about these pivots in the context of his own life and how he's witnessed these in the lives of others that he's worked with across his career. So I think that's another wonderful example as well.
thank you.
Thanks, Luis. What I wanted to do was mention that the things that I have learned about narrative and storytelling and the relationship between narrative and systems, I've actually learned from you over the last several months. Those of us in IRL have been engaging with you through your work with Storytellers for Change. And I would like for you to share with our listeners a little bit about Storytellers for Change and the resources that are available to them there as well. So whatever you'd like to share about your organization for our listeners.
Yeah, thank you, Crystal. So absolutely. I think there's a couple of resources. We have a toolkit that's available for free that was part of another collaboration that it's called Crafting Anti-Racist Narratives for Community Development. And it's a toolkit that guides you through the process of unpacking dominant narratives and then intentionally crafting and envisioning emergent transforming narratives that advance anti-racist and equitable healing center work. It has a focus on community development, but the toolkit itself is pretty accessible to be modified to apply to other fields. And that's freely accessible online. And then we have a handful of different storytelling courses and resources that focus on everything from developing personal narrative to developing organizational narrative to developing and crafting narrative strategies to engaging with the practice of thinking about how do we center equity and asset-based practices in our storytelling work. There's a variety of different lenses with each one of our courses, but all of them are meant to deepen many of the practices and concepts and apply them into our respective fields and areas of work that we've been discussing in this podcast.
Thanks for sharing, Luis. And we encourage our listeners to check out Storytellers for Change at storytellersforchange.com. Luis, we know that, doing this work and working towards equity and against systems of oppression can take its toll, right? We've mentioned Dr. Sean Ginwright many times in this episode and his book, Four Pivots. And one of the quotes that speaks to me it says that changing things that are broken in our society requires individual and collective healing. And I just wonder, like, as a final thought, kind of as a check out question, can you share with our listeners, how do you engage in self-care as you continue to engage in this difficult work?
Yeah, certainly. There's a few things, but I'll be brief. I'll start with rest and sleep. That's more and more over the years. I've shifted my mindset around what it means to prioritize that. And then that's also just carried into shifting how I start my days. It's not with my work email. It's waking up and taking time to stretch and to read and to slow down and to have a steady, calm heart and spirit as I engage with the world. And of course, as you can probably imagine, my capacity to do that shifts depending on what else is happening in my life. However, I think the biggest takeaway for me has been creating the space for me not to feel like a couple of years ago, the time between me waking up and me being in front of my laptop, reading emails and responding to emails and working, I trained myself a long time ago to think that my best writing, my best work, my best output is in the morning. So I was always thinking, oh, as soon as I'm awake, I need to go and do this work because this is when the quality work's going to happen. And that was so intrinsically connected to my sense of value and worth and contribution to justice work as well, that I did not realize like what was that was doing to my subconscious also and to my sense of worth and to what else was happening in my life. And now it's at least 2 hours, if not more sometimes, between the time I wake up and the time that I actually move into beginning to do what here we would call quote unquote work. But also like realizing, right, that rest itself, the purpose of that rest is not so that I can be better at work, although I am, I believe, better at my work because I give myself space for rest. The purpose of that rest space is rest and the joy of rest and the joy that I find in reading science fiction or magical realism or novels or writing or poetry, whatever I'm engaging with, although I've given up a lot of what I call like my work reading during that time. And I've loved that. So I find that has given me much needed space. And I'll close with this. Like a couple of years ago, I was catching up with a friend and I was talking about like how I didn't have time for reading for joy. And my friend sort of laughed and said, "What do you mean? Like you're reading all the time and you make time. Like time is a construct, right? It's sort of going back to this idea of these tensions, right? And just realizing how much of my agency I was giving up in even beholding myself to a statement like that. So I'm not going to say that it's necessarily easy to just suddenly shift your schedule and rethink and reimagine what that looks like. I know this can look very differently for any of us. I just know for me, it's been progressively over the last few years, shifting how I spend my time so that I can honor this rest that I know I need and holding on to it, because I've also learned that it's also very easy to give it away. So I'm still very much figuring out how do I practice this in an ongoing basis. And I started by saying that in my check-in, that I feel rooted. And I feel like a big reason why is because of this practice.
transforming oneself before we transform our community, right? And doing this revolutionary work internally first. That is one of the first things we actually sensed, Crystal and I, the humility and the depth in character building that you took on for yourself. And that in and of itself just distinguish yourself from others that we have spoken to. So thank you. We and IRL are so grateful that our path crossed, and we certainly hope that we continue crossing our paths. And we appreciate your time today that you spent with us to record this podcast. Thank you so much, Luis.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Crystal.
Thank you, Luis, and thank you so much to our listeners. As always, we want this to be a two-way conversation, so we'd love to hear from you. What promising practices have been impactful in your work to achieve health equity? How do you think storytelling can support or play a part in your health equity work? Share your thoughts with us via our LinkedIn page, where we will also share our show notes and the resources that Luis has highlighted in today's episode. And don't forget to subscribe to the Promising Practices for Health Equity podcast so you never miss an episode. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again for joining us today. And remember, we're all on this journey together, and every step we take together brings us closer to a healthier, more just world. Until next time, thank you.
Promising Practices for Health Equity is produced by the Interdisciplinary Research Leaders Program, a national leadership program of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. A special thanks to our guests, our production team at Studio Americana, and to you, our listeners, for being a part of this important conversation.